On a clear, warm day in May of 2010, Greenwood Cemetery in North St. Louis County was the site of a memorial dedication that honored one of American history's most significant former slaves.
This project definitely had a guardian angel, and I believe her name was Harriet.
Harriet Robinson Scott was the wife of Dred Scott. Their complicated 11-year legal fight to free themselves from slavery ended in defeat with a controversial United States Supreme Court decision. Their freedom was eventually purchased by former owners.
She lived as a widow 18 years. And think about that. She lived through the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, which was not a nice time in St. Louis. And I think it would be safe to say that many considered her the widow of the most infamous man in America.
About 5 miles northeast of Greenwood Cemetery is Calvary Cemetery, the final resting place of Harriet Scott's husband, Dred. Their saga fueled passions that eventually sparked the Civil War. Those events have been passed down by historians and in the oral history of Scott's descendants. Lynn Jackson's father, John Madison, was a great-grandson of the Scotts. Before his death in 2007, Madison showed me a sketch of his famous ancestors. Historians believe it's a composite based on images from an 1857 Harper's Magazine article. Madison said he was about 10 years old when he first learned of his great-grandparents' place in history.
From time to time, people would come to the house to talk to my mother, and she would always explain why they were there. And that would be the people who had come to ask questions about the family. Our history books don't deal too much with it. And
does that bother you?
Yeah, because I think it's as important as anything else that they keep putting in the book.
Dred Scott's story began with his birth in Virginia around the late 1790s. The property of Peter Blow, it's believed Scott grew up a companion of the Blow children and performed tasks associated with household slaves. After moving with his master to Alabama, they settled in St. Louis in 1830. Within 3 years of arriving in St. Louis with the Blow family, Scott was sold to Army surgeon Dr. John Emerson. Part of Dr. Emerson's military career took him across the Mississippi River into Illinois and other territory where slavery was prohibited. Perhaps because he was unaware he was on free land, Scott made no attempt to liberate himself during that period. He did, however, meet and marry another slave, Harriet Robinson. In order that they could remain together, Dr. Emerson purchased Harriet from another Army officer. Over the next several years, the Scotts had 2 daughters. They returned to St. Louis in 1842 and stayed with Emerson's wife Irene while the doctor served at a post in Florida. The next year, Emerson died, and his widow hired out all the Scotts to work for other families. What happened during that period apparently led Dred and Harriet Scott to sue for their freedom on the grounds they once lived in free territory. This is where the legal drama first unfolded, inside the building we know of today as the old courthouse. In 1846, Dred and Harriet Scott filed separate petitions for their freedom. Scott versus Emerson came up for trial the following year. Old Courthouse historian Bob Moore says when the Scotts initially sued, it was by no means an unusual or unprecedented move.
I went into the St. Louis court records and actually went through them case by case and came up with well over 200 other suits that were launched. And so that's not just 200 individual people, it's 200 suits. And then when you add up all the people, it comes up to nearly 250 people that would be represented by all those suits that took place in court here in this building. I would say about 50% of the people who sued for their freedom actually obtained it, and the others didn't, for one reason or another.
David Konig is a professor of history and law at Washington University.
When it was begun in 1846, it was a slam dunk. It was something solidly based in precedent, something that others in his similar situation had won cases on before.
In Missouri?
In Missouri. And there was little reason to expect the outcome that occurred.
The Scotts initially lost in circuit court, but they were granted a retrial. That second trial was delayed by 2.5 years because of a terrible fire in the city and an outbreak of cholera. The jury in the second trial decided the Scotts had the right to be free, but Irene Emerson appealed the decision to the Missouri Supreme Court. Unfortunately for the Scotts, the delay between the first and second trials would work against them.
In the meantime, the Missouri Constitution had changed, And the judges of the Missouri State Supreme Court were now elected by the people. They were no longer appointed. This brought in a pro-slavery Supreme Court in Missouri. And in particular, Judge Robert Wells, whose decision on this was that times now have changed, as he said, when this case came in 1850. And he saw this case as a way to poke abolitionists in the eye.
While their suit dragged on, the Scotts were forced to continue working for other people on behalf of their owner. The legal papers documenting the circuit court cases still exist in the archives of the circuit clerk.
This is the motion that was filed to have the sheriff hire out Harriet Scott until they could figure out whether or not she was free. There is a concept in law that you don't want property to waste.
The same principle applied to Harriet's husband. The Barnum Hotel was where Dred Scott worked as a porter while his fate was decided. Irene Emerson won her appeal, and again, the Scotts were returned to slavery. The state Supreme Court decision attracted the attention of prominent attorneys, including Roswell Field. He took the Dred Scott case to the U.S. District Court in St. Louis, where a new defendant was named.
Instead of suing Mrs. Emerson, that is to say Dred's former owner, now the suit was made against Mrs. Emerson's brother, John Sanford. Dr. Emerson, Mrs. Emerson's husband, had died, and Mrs. Emerson was moving to Massachusetts to marry a man by the name of Chaffee, who incidentally was anti-slavery. All of the estate, the slaves and so on, were now under the direction of Mr. Sanford, who was Mrs. Emerson's brother, but was a resident of the state of New York. This made for a diversity case. Dred Scott, a resident of Missouri, John Sanford, a resident of New York. This brought it to the federal courts under a diversity issue. And in that sense, a new, very powerful issue was brought to the case. And that is to say, the issue of Dred's citizenship.
But again, the ruling was against Scott. Now a once obscure case made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now it was more than just a case of a slave trying to free himself, more than just a case of states' rights. It was an issue that cut to the very definition of freedom, an issue widening the gulf between the pro- and anti-slavery states. On March 6, 1857, the United States Supreme Court ruled that neither slaves nor free blacks had rights. The court also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because it prohibited slavery in the territories.
The Dred Scott case and the ripple effect that it created definitely put people on edge, and it sent people down that road to what happened later on. The famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, when Abraham Lincoln ran against Stephen Douglas for the Senate in Illinois, took place the year after the Dred Scott decision. And in every one of the debates, Dred Scott came up, and both men argued about the Dred Scott decision. Lincoln, of course, arguing on the side of Dred and Harriet Scott. Those debates got national headlines, and Lincoln's arguments were very persuasive and were printed in newspapers all over the country.
In spite of his crushing court defeat, Scott finally won what he fought for. The Blow family, his original owners, and the ones who financed his legal battles, bought Scott's freedom. Sadly, Scott died of tuberculosis the year after the High Court ruling. For 9 years, he was buried in a Midtown St. Louis cemetery. After it closed, Scott's remains were moved to an unmarked grave in Calvary. The marker, purchased by Blow descendants, was added in 1957. But for more than a century, the fate of Harriet Scott was a mystery. It wasn't solved until Ruth Ann Hager, a reference specialist with the St. Louis County Library, started digging through archives, searching for answers.
Harriet, who's buried here in the cemetery, shares her grave. With her is her 2-day-old grandson, Edward.
Cemetery records provide only an approximate location of the grave, but it's evidence enough to warrant a gravestone and the memorial pavilion. Participants in the pavilion dedication ceremony included members of Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And professional storyteller Carole Shelton paid homage to Harriet Scott with a performance as Scott.
Every time we stumbled, every time there was a setback, there was somebody there to bend down and lift us up, and we'd go marching on.
The ceremony is yet another tribute to the family of Lynn Jackson, who continues to tell the story of Dred Scott as she was told by her father.
Before he passed, we were going over some papers, and he actually got up out of the chair and said, "Just let me come and hug my daughter." And he just laid his shoulder on mine and cried, because he didn't know who was going to do it. I didn't know I was going to do it, but I'm very humbled and proud to be able to.